Hey everyone, I'm Peter Stories here to guide you today. If you use this video to drift off to sleep, please tap like, hit subscribe, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. Now settle in, get cozy, and let yourself relax. The Hunger That Walks, a Brandon Holloway story. Boundary Waters Canoe Area, Wilderness, Minnesota. September 2008. The water looked wrong. Brandon Holloway had spent 12 years studying aquatic ecosystems across North America, and he'd never seen a lake surface quite like this. The morning sun hit Saginaga Lake at the perfect angle, should have turned it into hammered copper. But instead the water seemed to absorb the light, drinking it down into depths that suddenly felt too deep, too hungry. He adjusted the straps on his Kelty pack and checked his Garmin eTrex one more time. The coordinates were correct. Lauren Mackenzie's last known location, approximately 48.1374 degrees, 90.9125 degrees W, 2 miles southwest of his current position along the Canadian border. 3 days missing. 22 years old. Graduate student from the University of Minnesota studying northern forest ecology. Last radio contact, September 17th at 14:23 hours, reporting she was establishing camp near an unnamed creek that fed into Saginaga. Her voice on the recording had been calm, professional. Base, this is Mackenzie. Setting up Site 17. Found something interesting in the sediment samples. We'll report findings tonight. Over. She never made that evening check-in. Brandon loaded his 17-foot Kevlar canoe, a Winona Wilderness model he'd used for 6 seasons, and pushed off from the boat launch at the Seagull Outfitters station. The stern dug into the water with a familiar resistance, but something felt off about the weight distribution. He'd packed the same way he always did. Dry bags secured low and centered, field kit accessible in the forward compartment, emergency beacon clipped to his PFD. Everything by the book. Still, the canoe seemed to list slightly to starboard, as if an invisible passenger sat just behind his right shoulder. The paddle strokes came automatically, the J-stroke correction every third pull, keeping him on course. The rhythm usually cleared his mind, let him observe. That's what made him good at his job. The ability to notice what others missed, to read the subtle language of ecosystems in distress. But this morning, the familiar meditation of paddling felt corrupted by a different kind of attention. He kept glancing back over his shoulder at nothing. The tree line along the shore seemed too dense, the shadows between the red pines and paper birch too absolute. He'd reviewed Lauren's field notes last night at the ranger station. Careful, methodical observations of soil composition, pH levels, vegetation surveys. The kind of solid, unimaginative work that got you through a master's program. Nothing remarkable until the final entry, dated September 16th. Unusual animal behavior observed. White-tailed deer moving northeast in groups of 8 to 12, outside normal pattern. Local flora showing stress markers inconsistent with seasonal change. Temperature anomalies recorded. We'll investigate further. Temperature anomalies. In September, in northern Minnesota. Brandon checked his thermometer. 72 degrees Fahrenheit. Perfect, late summer weather. A light breeze carried the scent of sun-warmed pine needles and the mineral tang of lake water. Everything exactly as it should be. So why did he feel cold? The canoe glided past a small island choked with alder and willow. A great blue heron exploded from the shallows with a harsh croak that made Brandon's paddle skip across the surface. His heart hammered against his ribs. Ridiculous overreaction to a common bird. But the heron's flight path struck him as wrong somehow. It was flying northeast, low and fast, the way prey animals moved when something hunted them, the way the deer had been moving in Lauren's notes. He consulted his map, an actual paper USGS topographic, not the limited display on his GPS. Technology was useful, but Brandon had been in enough remote areas to know that batteries died, satellites lost signal, electronics failed at the worst possible moments. The unnamed creek Lauren mentioned would be approximately 45 minutes of paddling, assuming he maintained his current pace. The shoreline grew more irregular as he moved southwest, the lake fragmenting into a maze of bays and channels that could swallow a person completely. 1 million acres of wilderness, fewer than a dozen entry points. Once you paddled beyond the day-use areas, you entered a landscape that had changed little since the fur trade era, when Ojibwe and Cree peoples navigated these waters in birch bark canoes. The Forest Service managed the boundary waters, but management here meant mostly staying out of the way, letting the ecosystem function as it had for millennia. It was the kind of primordial space that reminded you how thin the veneer of civilization really was, how quickly the animal part of your brain could resurface when you were truly alone. Brandon passed a campsite on the North Shore. Fire ring cold, the ash scattered by wind. Someone had left their site cleaner than they'd found it, following leave-no-trace principles. But something about the abandoned fire ring bothered him. The stones had been arranged in a pattern he didn't recognize, not the simple circle most campers built. They formed a shape that reminded him of... what? A symbol he'd seen somewhere, in some context he couldn't quite recall. The paddle felt heavier with each stroke. His shoulders ached in a way that didn't match the effort he'd expended. He'd been on much longer expeditions with heavier loads. This should have been an easy morning paddle, but his body was responding as if he'd been working for hours, days even. A gnawing emptiness had settled into his stomach despite the protein bar he'd eaten an hour ago. The channel narrowed, squeezing between granite outcroppings that rose 30 feet above the waterline. Lichen covered the rock faces in abstract patterns, greens and oranges and whites that created what almost looked like figures if you stared too long. Brandon forced his eyes back to the water. Pattern recognition was a survival trait, but it could misfire, making you see intention where only randomness existed. Pareidolia, seeing faces in the clouds, hearing voices in white noise. But he could have sworn one of those lichen patterns looked like a handprint, a massive handprint. The creek mouth appeared exactly where the coordinates indicated, a narrow opening almost hidden by overhanging cedars. Brandon guided the canoe into the channel, ducking under low-hanging branches that scraped across his shoulders like skeletal fingers. The water here was darker, stained brown by tannic acid from decomposing vegetation. Perfectly normal, perfectly explainable, but it looked like the color of old blood. The current pushed weakly against him, the creek flowing down from higher elevations to the north. He had to work harder to maintain forward momentum, and the narrow channel meant he couldn't use full paddle strokes. The canoe bumped against submerged roots and rocks that his depth perception somehow failed to track. Tree roots writhed beneath the surface like grasping hands. "Stop it," he told himself. "You're a scientist. Observe, don't interpret. Record data, don't create narratives." But narratives were how humans made sense of the world. Stories were survival tools, ways of encoding information about danger and opportunity. When the Ojibwe told stories about the creatures that lived in these forests, they weren't just entertaining children around campfires. They were passing down genuine accumulated knowledge about this place. Warnings that had kept people alive for hundreds of generations. Warnings about things that walked through the winter woods. Things that were always hungry. Things that fed on. Brandon shook his head, dispelling the thought. He'd read too much last night diving into the background research on local folklore. The ranger station had a small library, and he'd found himself drawn to a section on indigenous traditions. Pulled a book on Ojibwe stories almost without thinking. He'd only meant to skim it, get some cultural context for the region. Instead, he'd read for 2 hours, growing increasingly unsettled by accounts of the Wendigo, the winter cannibal spirit that transformed humans who violated the ultimate taboo. Just stories, he'd told himself. Metaphors for the real dangers of isolation and starvation, psychological coping mechanisms for extreme conditions. But the descriptions had been vivid, specific, consistent across hundreds of years and vast geographic distances. What explained that kind of narrative persistence? Mass hallucination? Cultural transmission of shared delusions? Or something else? Something his scientific framework couldn't easily accommodate. The canoe scraped across a shallow section, the sound like fingernails on bone. Brandon used his paddle to push off from a boulder, and his hand came away covered in a film that felt too slick, too cold. He wiped it on his pants and immediately regretted it. Now the coldness was spreading through the fabric, seeping into his skin. He rounded a bend and saw the tent. Lauren's tent. a North Face Mountain 25, yellow fabric now faded and streaked with moisture. It was pitched on a small clearing about 20 feet from the water's edge, positioned properly with the opening facing away from prevailing winds. Emergency orange marker tape had been tied to nearby trees, the kind you use to make your camp visible for aerial search and rescue. Standard procedure. Everything looked correct from a distance. Everything except the silence. Brandon's training kicked in. He secured the canoe, pulling it fully onto shore and tying the painter to a birch tree. He noted the absence of any other boat. Lauren's canoe was gone, which matched the initial search team's report. He called out, voice echoing too loudly in the stillness. "Lauren Mackenzie, this is Brandon Holloway with the Forest Service. If you can hear me, please respond." Nothing. Not even the natural ambient noise that should have filled a healthy forest. No squirrels chittering, no birds calling, no insects humming. Just a silence so complete it seemed to have weight and texture, pressing against his eardrums like water pressure. He approached the tent slowly, noting details with the automatic precision of long training. The zipper was open about 6 inches. The rain fly was properly secured. A small pile of firewood sat stacked near a ring of stones. That same unsettling pattern again, he noticed, like the fire ring he'd passed earlier. The wood was bone dry despite the morning dew that coated everything else. "Lauren?" he called again, knowing somehow that he wouldn't get an answer. He knelt beside the tent entrance and pulled the zipper down fully. The sound was too loud, a mechanical scream in the oppressive quiet. Empty, or rather, not quite empty. Lauren's sleeping bag lay twisted in the corner, half inside out, as if she'd thrashed her way out of it in a panic. Her field notebook sat open on top, pages covered in her neat handwriting. Her headlamp hung from the tent's ceiling loop, battery dead or drained. And there, scattered across the tent floor, were things that made Brandon's scientific mind stutter and misfire. Bones, small ones, cleaned white. Bird bones, maybe, or squirrel. Arranged in patterns that echoed the stone arrangements outside. And between the bones, scratched directly into the tent's floor fabric with something sharp. Words in a handwriting that started as Lauren's neat script, but degenerated into frantic scratching. "So hungry, can't stop eating. The cold, the cold, the cold." And at the bottom, in letters so deeply scored they'd nearly cut through the fabric, "It's inside me now." Brandon's hand was shaking as he reached for the field notebook. This was evidence. This was data. He needed to document everything, photograph it, preserve the scene. But part of him, the part that still processed information on a gut level, that hadn't been entirely domesticated by graduate school and peer review, wanted to run. Wanted to paddle back to civilization as fast as his arms could manage and pretend he'd never seen any of this. He forced himself to photograph the tent interior with his Canon power shot, the flash creating harsh shadows that made the bone patterns look like they were moving. Then he picked up the notebook and began to read. The early entries were exactly what he'd seen back at the ranger station. Soil samples, vegetation surveys, water quality tests. Lauren had been conducting a baseline environmental assessment for her thesis on climate change indicators in northern boreal forests. Solid, publishable work. But starting on September 15th, the observations changed. Found a deer carcass today, approximately 1.2 miles northeast of camp. Unusual consumption pattern. Entire animal stripped clean, bones cracked open for marrow. No scavenger tracks nearby. Estimated time of death less than 12 hours based on decomposition, but meat appears desiccated beyond normal time frame. Collected hair samples for analysis. Feeling unusually tired despite adequate sleep. September 16th. Temperature dropped significantly overnight. Recorded 34° Fahm at 0600 hours. Unseasonably cold. Multiple thermometer readings consistent. No weather pattern on NOAA forecast to explain sudden change. Frost on tent despite daytime highs near 70° Fahm. Does cold follow me? Ridiculous thought. Sleep deprived. So tired. So hungry. Ate 2 full meals this morning and still feel empty. September 17th. The final entry. Can't get warm. Wearing every layer I brought. Built fire, but heat doesn't penetrate. The hunger is worse. Ate all my food, all of it. Energy bars, freeze-dried meals, trail mix, everything. Still so empty. Heard something moving through camp last night. Thought it was a bear initially, but the footprints... The entry stopped mid-sentence. A long smear of what looked like dried blood trailed down the page. Brandon's radio crackled suddenly, making him drop the notebook. Static and distortion. Then a voice that might have been the ranger station or might have been something else. Something that knew how to make the sounds of human speech without understanding what the words meant. Alo, Osician, Ern, Ak. He keyed the transmit button. Base, this is Holloway. I found Mackenzie's camp. She's not here. Evidence suggests... What? Evidence suggested what? That she'd gone mad? That something impossible had happened? That every rational explanation his mind constructed felt like a lie? Only static answered him. The radio's battery indicator showed full charge, but when he tried to transmit again, nothing happened. Dead electronics. Classic. He should have felt more alarmed. This was a genuine emergency situation. Lost hiker, disturbing evidence, communications failure. Protocol was clear. Secure the scene, activate the emergency beacon on his PFD, wait for the search and rescue team. They'd have a helicopter overhead within 2 hours. Ground team moving in by evening. But Brandon found himself standing up, walking to the tree line, following the footprints that Lauren's journal had mentioned. He didn't remember deciding to do this. His body was moving with a kind of autopilot conviction, drawn forward by curiosity that felt increasingly like compulsion. The prints were there, just inside the tree line, barefoot, human-shaped more or less, but wrong in proportions, too long, too narrow, the toe impression spread too wide. And the depth of the print suggested something impossibly heavy, far denser than human body weight could account for. The trail led northeast, directly away from camp, toward higher ground, toward the deeper wilderness, toward places where the old maps simply said, unmapped terrain, and left vast stretches blank. Brandon followed. The forest here was older than the second-growth timber that dominated most of the boundary waters. These were old-growth red and white pines, some of them 4 feet in diameter at chest height, survivors of the great logging era that had stripped this region bare in the 19th century. They'd been too remote, too difficult to access, so they'd stood while everything around them had been cut and hauled away. Now they towered overhead, their canopy so dense that the understory was relatively clear, carpeted with needles that muffled his footsteps. The silence was total, absolute. Not the peaceful quiet of a healthy forest, but something more like acoustic death, as if sound itself was being absorbed by the trees, swallowed into some vast emptiness. The temperature dropped with each step he took. Brandon could see his breath now, white mist in air that his thermometer still read as 70 degrees. The discrepancy should have alarmed him more than it did, should have sent him running back to camp, back to the canoe, back to rational civilization where thermometers worked and cold only came with meteorological justification. But the hunger was growing. He'd eaten breakfast 3 hours ago, 2 protein bars and an apple, adequate fuel for a morning of paddling. But his stomach felt cavernous, empty in a way that transcended simple caloric need. This was a hunger that ached in his bones, that made his teeth feel loose in his jaw, that turned every living thing around him into potential sustenance. When had he last eaten? Breakfast felt like days ago. Weeks. The memory seemed to belong to someone else, someone who still thought food was about nutrition and not about the desperate animal need to fill an emptiness that kept growing, kept demanding, kept screaming inside his skull. Focus. Document. Observe. The footprints continued, and now Brandon noticed other signs. Trees with bark stripped away in long vertical gouges, the marks spaced like claw swipes but too high, too violent. The exposed wood underneath was blackened as if by frostbite, though that was impossible. Wood didn't get frostbite. Dead plant cells couldn't suffer from cold damage the way living tissue could. Except the trees weren't dead. Sap oozed from the wounds, sluggish and dark. And when Brandon touched it, why did he touch it? The coldness spread into his finger like venom, racing up through his hand, his arm, his chest. He yanked his hand back, stared at the sap coating his index finger. It was moving, crawling across his skin like it was alive, seeking entry into his body through pores and cracks in any available opening. Brandon wiped it frantically on his pants, but the coldness remained, burrowing deeper, settling into his bones like ice crystals forming in his marrow. This wasn't real. Couldn't be real. Hallucination, maybe. Carbon monoxide poisoning? No, he'd been outdoors all morning. Infection? Fever? Some kind of neurotoxin from an insect bite? His mind cycled through possible explanations, each one weaker than the last, until he was forced to confront the possibility that his training hadn't prepared him for. What if the stories were true? What if the Wendigo wasn't metaphor but memory? What if generations of Ojibwe and Cree peoples had been recording actual encounters, documenting a genuine phenomenon that existed outside the boundaries of acceptable scientific reality? What if folklore was a kind of data, and he'd been too arrogant, too certain of his framework, to consider that indigenous knowledge might contain truths his culture had forgotten or refused to acknowledge? The footprints ended at the base of a massive white pine, its trunk scarred with deep parallel gouges that went up 30 feet. Something had climbed this tree, something large enough to leave marks in wood that felt more like meteor impacts than scratches. Brandon looked up into the canopy, his neck cracking as he tilted his head back. The shadows between the branches seemed too deep, too solid. And there, maybe 50 feet up, he could see what might have been a shape, what might have been movement, what might have been watching him with eyes that had never been human, even when they'd first opened in a human skull. A sound came from above. Not quite words, not quite wind. Something between speech and hunger, between language and pure need. It spoke in a voice that might once have been Lauren Mackenzie's, before the cold had gotten inside her, before the hunger had rewritten every cell in her body into something new. So empty. Brother. Brandon's legs gave out. He sat down hard on the pine needle carpet, his body finally acknowledging what his mind had been fighting. This was real. This was happening. The impossible was occurring exactly as the stories had promised it would, and no amount of training or rationality or scientific method could protect him from the truth standing in front of him. Above him, something began to climb down, slowly, taking its time. Why hurry when prey was already paralyzed by understanding? He should run, should move, should do something other than sit here watching his death descend from the trees. But the hunger was so strong now, so overwhelming, that the idea of moving felt abstract. His body wanted to conserve energy, wanted to curl up and wait for warmth that would never come, wanted to sleep the sleep that had no waking. How long had it been since he'd eaten? Days? Weeks? The protein bar this morning was a distant memory, the ghost of sustenance that had done nothing to fill the void growing inside him. When was the last time he'd felt truly satisfied, truly full, truly warm? The shape reached the lower branches. Brandon could see it more clearly now, and he understood why the footprints had looked wrong. The proportions were human only in the loosest sense. Elongated limbs that bent at too many angles, a torso that seemed to stretch and contract with each movement, a head that was too large and somehow too small at the same time. And the face. Oh God, the face. Lauren Mackenzie's features are what they'd become. Skin stretched tight over a skull that had reshaped itself, jaw distended to accommodate teeth that were too long, too sharp, too numerous, eyes that reflected light like an animal's tapetum lucidum, glowing with a hunger that had consumed everything else. Personality, memory, humanity. All of it devoured by the endless need that no amount of feeding could ever satisfy. This was the final lesson of the Wendigo. This was what happened when the hunger became everything. When the cold got inside and froze out every other human impulse. You didn't die. You transformed. You became appetite incarnate, condemned to walk the winter woods forever seeking satisfaction that would never come, feeding and feeding and feeding without ever being full. The creature that had been Lauren dropped to the ground 20 feet away. Brandon could hear its breathing, a wet, rattling sound like wind through a frozen chest cavity. It stood there, swaying slightly, studying him with those terrible glowing eyes. "Brother," it whispered again. And this time, Brandon understood. It was trying to warn him. Some tiny fragment of Lauren Mackenzie was still trapped inside that twisted form, screaming a warning to anyone who could hear, "Don't become this. Don't let the hunger win. Run while you still can." Brandon forced himself to stand. His legs shook, barely supporting his weight. The hunger clawed at his insides, demanding that he stay, that he give in, that he let the transformation take him. How easy it would be to simply stop fighting, to accept the cold, to embrace the emptiness, to become something that never had to feel human guilt or human fear ever again. He took one step backward, then another. The creature's head snapped toward him, tracking the movement with predatory precision. Its mouth opened impossibly wide, and from somewhere deep in its chest came a sound that might have been words in Anishinaabemowin, the language of Lauren's ancestors, the old words for old things that walked between the worlds. "Windigu Waban, the Wendigo sees you. Brother soon. Feast together." Brandon turned and ran. The forest erupted behind him. He could hear the creature pursuing, its movement through the trees like a windstorm, like an avalanche, like hunger given physical form. Branches snapped. Trees groaned. The ground itself seemed to shake with the weight of something that should not exist, running at speeds nothing that size should achieve. He crashed through underbrush, tore past trees, his lungs burning with effort and the terrible cold that was spreading through his chest. His training was gone. His scientific detachment was gone. All that remained was the animal brain, the part that knew how to run from predators, that understood on a cellular level what it meant to be prey. The canoe. If he could reach the canoe, if he could get on the water, did the Wendigo follow into water? The stories didn't say. The stories focused on winter, on frozen lakes, on the deep woods where humans went to starve. But this was September. The water was still liquid. Maybe that mattered. Maybe that provided some protection. Something grabbed his ankle. Brandon went down hard, his face slamming into pine needles and moss. He twisted around, kicking frantically, and saw that it wasn't the creature that had caught him. It was a root. Just a root. Wrapped around his boot through impossible coincidence, or maybe something worse. Maybe the forest itself was conspiring to slow him down, to give the hunger time to catch up. He yanked his foot free and scrambled to his feet, but precious seconds had been lost. The sound of pursuit was closer now, so close. He could smell it, rotting meat and frozen soil and something else, something chemical and wrong, like the scent of hypothermia, like the smell of a body slowly dying from the inside out. The creek appeared ahead, and beyond it, his canoe, exactly where he'd left it. Brandon splashed into the water, gasping at the cold. When had it gotten so cold? And grabbed the canoe's gunwale. He pushed off with everything he had, throwing himself forward as the boat slid into deeper water. The creature burst from the tree line just as the canoe reached the center of the channel. It stood there on the shore, its impossible form silhouetted against the trees, and Brandon could see how wrong the proportions really were. It was easily 10 feet tall now, maybe more. Its limbs bent at angles that suggested multiple joints. Its spine curved in a way that would have broken a human back. But it didn't enter the water. It stood there swaying, watching him paddle away with those glowing eyes that had once belonged to a bright 22-year-old graduate student who just wanted to study forest ecology and maybe make a small contribution to humanity's understanding of climate change. "Brother," the creature called one last time, and the sound carried across the water like wind over ice. "Brother, it gets so cold, so hungry. Come back. Please come back." Then it turned and loped back into the forest, moving with that terrible, inhuman speed. And Brandon was alone on the creek with only his hammering heart and the impossible cold that had settled into his bones. He paddled. He paddled with every ounce of strength remaining in his body, driving the blade into the water again and again, not bothering with proper form or efficient stroke mechanics. He just needed distance, needed to get away from that place, that thing, that truth about what humans could become when the hunger got too strong. The lake appeared ahead, open water that looked suddenly like salvation. Brandon burst out of the creek channel and immediately turned east, aiming for the boat launch, for civilization, for witnesses and warmth and food and all the things that proved you were still human, still alive, still on the right side of the transformation. But the hunger was stronger now, growing with every stroke. His stomach felt like a cavern, like a void that extended beyond his physical body into some other dimension, where emptiness itself was hungry. When had he last eaten? This morning? Yesterday? Last week? The memory of food seemed abstract, theoretical, like something he'd read about but never actually experienced. He tried to remember what a protein bar tasted like, tried to recall the satisfaction of a good meal. But all he could think about was meat. Fresh meat, warm meat. Meat that still moved, that still bled, that could finally fill the terrible emptiness inside him. No. Focus. Paddle. Get to the boat launch. There would be people there. Rangers, other paddlers. You couldn't transform in front of witnesses. The hunger needed isolation, needed the deep woods, needed the solitude that let you forget what it meant to be human. His GPS showed he was making progress. 2 miles to the boat launch, then 1.5, then 1. The numbers counted down toward safety, toward rescue, toward the possibility of remaining himself. But the cold was spreading. His fingers were numb despite the warm September air. His breath came out in white clouds. The paddle felt like it was made of ice, burning his palms with cold instead of heat. And the hunger kept growing, kept demanding, kept whispering that there was an easier way, that transformation was relief, that becoming something else meant never feeling this desperate emptiness again. The boat launch appeared ahead. Vehicles in the parking lot, a family loading their canoe, normal people doing normal things in a world where the impossible didn't exist. Brandon aimed for the dock, his paddle strokes growing weaker. Almost there, almost safe, almost still human. The canoe's bow scraped against the dock. Brandon tried to stand, but his legs wouldn't support him. He collapsed onto the dock boards, gasping, shivering despite the afternoon sun. Someone was running toward him. A ranger, Jake Williams. He'd met him yesterday at the station. Jake's face showed concern, alarm, the professional worry of someone trained to handle emergencies. But not this. Not what was really happening. Holloway, Jesus, you look like hell. Did you find Mackenzie? Brandon opened his mouth to answer, but the words that came out weren't quite his, weren't quite human. They were colder, hungrier, emptier. So cold, so hungry. Haven't eaten in so long. Jake grabbed him under the arms, helped him sit up. Easy, man. When did you last eat? You've got food in your pack, right? Let's get you. No, Brandon gasped, forcing the words through lips that felt frozen. No, you don't understand. I found her camp. Found evidence. She's gone, Jake. Changed. And it's spreading. The cold, the hunger. He stopped, because Jake was staring at him with an expression Brandon recognized. The look you gave someone who'd been in the woods too long, who'd let isolation and stress break their grip on reality. The look that said, this person needs medical attention and psychiatric evaluation. And maybe Jake was right. Maybe the past few hours had been hallucination, stress-induced psychosis, some kind of neurological event that had transformed a routine search and rescue mission into a waking nightmare. That was the rational explanation. That was the explanation his training demanded he accept. But Brandon could still feel the cold in his bones, could still smell that terrible scent of rot and ice, could still hear Lauren's voice echoing across the water. Brother, come back. Jake was talking into his radio, calling for backup, for medical support, describing Brandon's condition in clinical terms that reduced terror to symptomology: dehydration, hypothermia, possible shock. All perfectly reasonable diagnoses that explained everything except the truth. They helped him into a ranger station vehicle. Someone gave him a thermal blanket, a bottle of water, a sandwich. The food tasted like nothing. Worse than nothing. He chewed and swallowed mechanically, trying to convince his body that this was sustenance, that this would fill the emptiness. But the hunger only grew stronger, spreading through him like frost through water. In the rearview mirror, as they drove away from the boat launch, Brandon caught a glimpse of the tree line. Something was standing there just inside the shadows. Tall, too tall, watching with eyes that reflected the afternoon sun like animal eyes, like the eyes of something that had once been human, but had forgotten what that meant. And Brandon understood with horrible clarity that he had two choices. He could tell the truth and be dismissed as crazy, locked in a psychiatric facility while the transformation continued unchecked. Or he could stay silent, return to civilization, try to fight the hunger with willpower and denial until the inevitable day when the cold won, and he walked into the deep woods to complete what had begun the moment he'd stepped into Lauren Mackenzie's camp. There was no third option. The Wendigo had seen him, had marked him, had welcomed him as brother, and once the winter cannibal spirit claimed you, there was no cure, no reversal, no way back to the warm human world of satisfying meals and comfortable sleep. Only hunger, only cold, only the endless winter that walked on two legs through the forests of the world, searching for others to transform, to consume, to welcome into the emptiness. Brandon pulled the thermal blanket tighter around his shoulders, but it didn't help. Nothing would help. Because the cold was inside him now, and it was spreading. And soon, maybe tomorrow, maybe next week, maybe next month, he would walk into the woods and not come back. And somewhere in the million acres of the boundary waters, something that had once been Lauren Mackenzie was waiting for him, patient as winter, hungry as the void between stars, waiting to welcome her brother home. Hope you felt genuine terror. If you appreciate authentic horror rooted in real folklore, consider following for more stories. Which moment scared you most? Share your theory about what happened to Brandon. Christopher Bennett had been a wildlife biologist for 15 years, long enough to recognize the difference between animal behavior and human negligence. As he parked his Forest Service vehicle at the Cascade Pass trailhead on the morning of August 12, 2008, he carried that distinction like armor. The overnight report from the ranger station sat on his passenger seat. Rachel Morrison, 26, doctoral candidate from the University of Washington, hadn't checked in for 3 days. Her research permit indicated she was studying alpine marmot populations at Sahali Arm, a brutal 7-mile hike that climbed from 3,600 feet to over 7,600 feet in elevation. Chris stepped out into air that tasted of glacial runoff and Douglas fir. The morning sun hadn't yet burned through the fog clinging to the valley floor, and the parking lot held only 2 other vehicles, both dusty, both clearly there for days. He noted their license plates in his field book out of habit, one from Oregon, one from British Columbia. Through his Motorola radio, dispatch confirmed that both belonged to hikers who'd already summited and returned. Rachel's Subaru Forester, forest green with university decals, sat alone at the far end of the lot. He approached it with the methodical attention he brought to everything. The doors were locked. A parking permit dated August 9th sat on the dashboard. He pressed his face to the window and cataloged the interior. Hiking boots in the back seat, energy bar wrappers, a North Face jacket, a dog-eared copy of Mammals of the Pacific Northwest. Nothing that suggested distress or hurried departure. Nothing that explained why a researcher who documented her GPS coordinates religiously for 6 weeks had suddenly gone silent. Chris shouldered his pack, 60 pounds of emergency gear, satellite phone, first aid supplies, and his own research equipment, and started up the trail. The Cascade Pass route was one of the park's most popular, a relatively well-maintained path that thousands of tourists hiked every summer, but relatively was doing heavy lifting. The trail gained 1,800 feet in the first 3 miles, switchbacking through old-growth forest, where western hemlock and red cedar created a perpetual twilight. His Garmin GPS unit, top of the line for 2008, showed his coordinates updating every few seconds. 48.4725 degree N, 121.0742 degree W. The familiarity of the routine settled his mind. He'd conducted 7 search and rescue operations in the North Cascades, all successful. People got turned around, they misjudged distances, they underestimated weather. Rachel Morrison was young, but not stupid. Her research notes showed someone detail-oriented and cautious. She'd marked every location she'd visited, every marmot colony she'd observed, with GPS precision that matched his own standards. That precision was exactly what worried him. People like that didn't just vanish. By the time he reached Cascade Pass proper at 5,400 feet, the fog had burned off to reveal the reason people came here. An amphitheater of jagged peaks, Johannesburg Mountain, Cascade Peak, Sahale Mountain, rising another 2,000 feet above him, their faces still streaked with last winter's snow. The meadow at the pass bloomed with lupine and Indian paintbrush, absurdly beautiful in the thin mountain air. A wooden sign pointed toward Sahale Arm, 5 miles, 2,200 feet of elevation gain, experienced hikers only. He paused to drink water and check his radio. Static. The topography here played hell with communications. Too many peaks, too much granite blocking signals. His satellite phone would work, but it was for emergencies only, $40 a minute. He noted the time in his field book, 10:47 a.m., temperature 62 degrees, wind calm, visibility excellent. The trail to Sahale Arm departed from anything resembling maintenance. It became a boot path, sometimes disappearing entirely across snowfields and scree slopes. Chris moved carefully, his eyes tracking for the usual signs: disturbed rocks, broken vegetation, anything that indicated recent passage. Rachel had been up here 3 days ago, according to her last GPS log. The weather had been clear since then. He should be seeing something. At 6,200 feet, he found her base camp. It sat in a small depression below the trail, tucked against a boulder to block the wind. A 2-person tent, MSR brand, still properly staked. A bear canister unopened. A camping stove, fuel canister 3/4 full. Chris circled the site twice, documenting everything with his digital camera, a Canon PowerShot that he'd bought specifically for evidence collection. The tent's zipper was closed but not locked. Inside, sleeping bag, inflatable pad, changes of clothes neatly folded, toiletries, backup batteries, and Rachel's field notebook. He sat outside the tent and read it. Rachel Morrison wrote like she thought, precisely with little wasted language. The entries detailed marmot behavior, population counts, territory observations. But the tone shifted in the last few pages. August 7th. Saw something strange today near the upper colony. Footprints in the snow, but wrong somehow. Human-sized, but the gait is off, too wide, almost like someone was dragging something. August 8th. Found more tracks. They circled the area but never seemed to go anywhere specific. Local ranger, older guy, didn't catch name, warned me about staying too late in the day. Said something about old troubles up here. Seemed genuinely spooked. August 9th, her last entry was different. The handwriting was messier, written in haste. Something's wrong with the upper snowfield. The temperature drops 30 degrees within 10 feet. No wind explanation. And I keep hearing. The sentence stopped mid-thought. The rest of the page was blank. Chris felt something shift in his chest, a sensation he recognized from his early days in the field, before he'd learned to trust only what he could measure. He pulled out his own notebook and wrote, possible head injury, altitude sickness, psychological break. But even as he wrote it, he knew those explanations felt inadequate. He'd seen altitude sickness. It made people confused, sluggish, irrational. It didn't make them abandon fully stocked campsites to wander onto exposed mountainsides. He keyed his radio anyway. Station 4, this is Bennett. I've located Morrison's base camp at approximately 6,200 feet on Sahale Arm. Campsite intact, no signs of distress, but subject not present. Continuing search toward upper colonies. Static then. Copy, Bennett. Weather window closes at 1600 hours. We've got a front moving in. He checked his watch. 12:15 p.m. Plenty of time. He left Rachel's camp undisturbed, it was evidence now, and continued climbing. The landscape above 6,500 feet belonged to a different world. Trees surrendered to low scrub, then to nothing but rock and snow. The Sahala Glacier sprawled above him, dirty white and crevassed, while below the valley fell away into green depths that made his stomach tighten. The trail vanished entirely in places, marked only by cairns that previous hikers had stacked. Chris followed them, his breathing labored in air that held half the oxygen of sea level. At 7,000 feet, he found the marmot colony Rachel had been studying. The burrows were obvious, holes in the scree slope, worn smooth by generations of use. He could see why she'd picked this spot. Dozens of colonies, each with clear sight lines, perfect for population research. He glassed the area with his binoculars, looking for movement. Nothing. Marmots should be everywhere in August, fattening themselves for hibernation. He spent 20 minutes watching and didn't see a single animal. In 15 years of field work, he'd never seen a colony this active simply abandoned. Animals didn't work that way. They had territories, food sources, instincts that overrode almost everything. He was about to move on when he noticed the snowfield. It lay 50 yards above the colony, a tongue of white that hadn't melted despite 3 weeks of summer sun. Chris approached it with his thermometer already out. At the edge, 58 degrees, 5 feet in, 52 degrees, 10 feet in, 41 degrees, 15 feet in, 28 degrees. He stopped. That wasn't possible. Not without wind, not without shade, not without some geographic explanation he couldn't see. He checked his GPS. 48.48922D, 121.0531 degree W. He photographed the thermometer readings, the snowfield, the surrounding terrain. Evidence, data, things he could measure. The cold wasn't the only wrong thing. The quality of light changed inside the snowfield's influence, becoming flat and gray despite the clear sky. The silence was absolute. No marmots, no pikas, no insects, nothing. Chris had spent enough time in the backcountry to know that silence this complete was unnatural. Something was keeping the animals away. He found the tracks 20 feet further in. They were humanoid, roughly boot-sized, but wrong in ways that made his brain stutter. The depth was inconsistent. Some impressions looked like they'd been made by someone weighing 300 pounds. Others barely dented the snow. The stride length varied impossibly, from normal walking pace to gaps of 6 or 7 feet. And they didn't lead anywhere. They circled, doubled back, crossed themselves in patterns that suggested either madness or something that didn't navigate the way humans did. Chris photographed everything. He measured the tracks, noting their dimensions in his field book. He told himself there were explanations. Snowmelt creating optical illusions, multiple people walking in the same area, tricks of perception at altitude. He told himself this even as he felt the temperature continuing to drop, even as his breath began to fog, even as his skin prickled with a sensation he hadn't felt since childhood, the certainty of being watched. Rachel? His voice fell dead in the air, absorbed by something other than distance. No response. But as he turned to leave, he saw it. A piece of orange fabric caught on a rock at the edge of the snowfield. He recognized it immediately, the same shade as the jacket that had been in Rachel's car. He bagged it carefully, noting the location, and tried to ignore the fact that the fabric wasn't torn. It had been cut precisely with something sharp. The front that weather had promised arrived early. Clouds materialized from nowhere, or everywhere, pouring over the peaks like water. The temperature plummeted. Within 20 minutes, Chris found himself in a whiteout, visibility reduced to arm's length. He activated the GPS's trackback function and started descending, moving carefully. Getting lost up here meant dying up here. The Cascades killed experienced hikers every year. Falls, exposure, gravity fed by a single wrong step. He was passing 6,800 feet when he heard the voice. Christopher. His name, clear despite the wind, coming from somewhere above and behind him. A woman's voice, but not Rachel's. Older, accented in a way he couldn't place. Eastern European, maybe. Romanian? He turned. The fog swirled and parted, and for just a moment, he saw a figure standing on an outcrop 50 feet upslope. Human-shaped but motionless, completely still despite wind that was now gusting hard enough to rock him on his feet. It wore dark clothing that might have been formal, archaic, wrong for the mountains. He couldn't see its face. "Hello?" He pulled his radio, tried dispatch. Dead static. The GPS screen flickered and went dark. Battery indicator showing full one moment and nothing the next. His expensive, reliable, thoroughly tested equipment had just failed simultaneously. The figure remained motionless. Chris's training, his years of field experience, his rational mind that had carried him through a decade and a half of backcountry work, all of it screamed at him to catalog this, to find the logical explanation. Hiker in distress, lost tourist, hallucination from altitude and stress. His mouth was dry, his hands shook, and not from cold. "I'm with the Forest Service," he called. "Are you injured? Do you need help?" The figure tilted its head, a motion so slight and so alien that Chris's hindbrain, the part that predated language and logic, began to scream. Then it moved. Not walked, moved. One moment on the outcrop, the next 10 feet closer, with no transition between positions, like frames cut from a film. Chris ran. He didn't think about it, didn't rationalize it, just turned and plunged down slope through the fog. His boots skidded on wet rock. He caught himself with his hands, felt skin tear, kept moving. Behind him, though behind felt like an inadequate description, he heard sounds that his brain refused to properly process. Footsteps, but with too many impacts. Breathing, but from a chest that moved wrong. And underneath it all, a smell that cut through the clean mountain air. Decay, sweet and thick and impossible to ignore. He made it to Rachel's camp at 6,200 feet before his legs gave out. The fog had thinned slightly, enough to see the tent, the bear canister, the familiar markers of human habitation. He crawled inside the tent and zipped it closed, knowing how absurd that was, how a nylon barrier meant nothing, but needing the psychological separation anyway. His satellite phone. He still had the satellite phone. He pulled it out with shaking hands, powered it on, waited for the connection. The screen glowed. Acquiring signal. Acquiring signal. 40 seconds later. Signal acquired. He dialed the ranger station. North Cascades Emergency Services. "This is Christopher Bennett, wildlife biologist, badge number 4722. I'm at 6,200 feet on Sahaley Arm. I need immediate extraction. Weather's closing in and..." He stopped. "And what? And I'm being stalked by something that moves wrong? And all my equipment failed? And I've lost my fucking mind at altitude." "Mr. Bennett, we're tracking the weather. It's going to be dark in 3 hours and we can't fly in these conditions. Can you make it back to the trailhead?" Could he? 7 miles downhill. He knew the route. Even in fog, even in failing light, he could do it. But the thought of leaving the tent, of going back out there with that thing, made his throat close. "There's someone up here," he said finally. "Or something. I can't." He sounded hysterical, irrational. Everything he'd built his career on not being. A pause on the other end. Then, "Sir, are you injured? Do you need medical evacuation?" "No. Yes. I don't know." He forced himself to breathe. "Can you tell me, have there been other disappearances up here, before Rachel Morrison?" Another pause. Longer. "Why do you ask that?" "Just answer the question. I'm transferring you to Ranger Williams. He's been here since the 70s. Hold, please." The hold music was incongruous, some pop station bleeding through satellite noise. Chris watched the tent walls. They moved in the wind, rippling, creating shadows, creating things that looked like hands pressing from outside. "This is Williams." The voice was older, rough with decades of cigarettes. "You're the biologist looking for the Morrison girl?" "Yes. How many others have disappeared up here?" "Why would you think there are others?" "Because I found her notebook. Because she wrote about you warning her. Because something is very fucking wrong up here. and I need to know what I'm dealing with." A long silence, then, "7? That I know of. Probably more before my time. All on Sahale Arm, all in August. First one was 1968, a mountaineer from Romania, Emil Vaduva. They found his body 3 weeks later. It looked like he'd been dead for months, but that wasn't possible given the timeline. Decomposition was all wrong. After that, every 10 years or so, someone vanishes up there. Never find bodies. Never find any explanation. What do the old-timers say? The locals? They say Vaduva's still up there. They say he died wrong. I don't know what that means exactly. Something about his burial, about rituals not being done. The Romanian community in Seattle tried to do something about it in the 70s, sent up a priest or something. He made it halfway up Sahale Arm and turned back. Wouldn't say why, just kept repeating the word Strigoi. Chris's mouth had gone completely dry. What does that mean? Hell if I know. Some kind of Romanian vampire thing? But not like Dracula. More like a ghost that thinks it's still alive, or a corpse that hasn't figured out it's dead. The stories say they returned for unfinished business, or because their death was violent, or because they were evil in life. They're supposed to be intelligent, vengeful, and very, very patient. The tent wall pressed inward, and Chris scrambled back. Through the nylon he saw a silhouette, human-shaped, motionless, watching. "It's here," he whispered into the phone. "Right now, outside the tent. Get out of there. Right now. Move downslope. Don't stop until you're at the trailhead." "I can't." "You don't have a choice. Listen to me. Those things in the stories, the Strigoi, they own their territory. The higher you are on that mountain, the more it belongs to them. You need to get lower. You need to leave." The silhouette moved. One moment visible, the next gone with no transition. Chris lunged for the tent zipper, burst outside. The campsite was empty, fog swirling. His pack sat where he'd left it, Rachel's things undisturbed. But on the tent, drawn in something dark that his brain absolutely refused to identify as blood, was a symbol. A circle with a cross, inverted, with strange letters around the perimeter that looked like no alphabet he recognized. He grabbed his pack and ran. The trail disappeared almost immediately in the fog. He followed his GPS, which had mysteriously revived, down through switchbacks that seemed to multiply, that led him past features he didn't remember from the ascent. Trees emerged from the mist, twisted in shapes that suggested agony. Rocks arranged themselves in patterns that his peripheral vision insisted were faces. And always, he heard the footsteps behind him. Never close enough to see clearly, never far enough to forget. At 4,000 feet in the old-growth forest where twilight reigned even at midday, he found the others. They hung from trees like grotesque ornaments. Not recently, these were old, reduced to bones and scraps of fabric. 7 of them, he counted, though the fog made it hard to be certain. 7 disappearances, 7 bodies, all displayed in a rough circle around a clearing where something had burned the ground black decades ago. At the clearing's center stood a wooden marker, weathered almost to illegibility. Chris approached despite every instinct screaming at him to run. He had to know. The marker was a grave, or had been. The name, barely visible, Emil Vaduva, 1934-1968. Someone had scratched newer words beneath, Nen mormentat, necredentios, blestimat. Chris didn't speak Romanian, but he knew cognates when he saw them. Unburied, unfaithful, cursed. They left me incomplete. The voice came from behind him, and Chris spun. The figure stood at the clearing's edge, and for the first time Chris saw it clearly. It was a man, or had been. Tall, gaunt, dressed in what might have once been climbing gear from the 1960s. But the details were wrong. The skin was gray, waxy, pulled too tight over the bones. The eyes were white, filmed over, yet they tracked Chris with perfect precision. And the mouth, when it opened, revealed teeth that were yellowed, broken, and far too sharp. "My body lies nowhere," the thing said. Its English carried a heavy accent, each word carefully shaped. My soul can find no rest. They buried me without the rituals, without the proper words. They left my mouth open. They left my heart intact. They did not bind me. Chris's hand found his radio, but he couldn't make himself key it, couldn't make himself move. I didn't mean to kill the first one, Vaduva continued, moving forward with that same reality-skipping motion. I was confused, hungry. The death was confusing. But then I understood. I could never leave, never rest. So I made this place mine, my territory, my hunting ground. It gestured to the hanging bodies. They keep me company, in their way. Where's Rachel? Chris's voice cracked. Where's Rachel Morrison? The thing's head tilted. The dark-haired girl she sees now, she understands, she is becoming. Chris ran again, but this time his legs were water, his coordination gone. He made it 20 feet before he tripped over a root and went down hard. The thing was on him in an instant, no transition, just suddenly there. The smell was overwhelming. Rot and earth and something underneath that was worse. Something chemical and wrong. Its hand, cold and impossibly strong, grabbed his jacket. You will join them, it said. Or you will run, and every year you will remember this place. And every year you will wonder if I'm following you down the mountain, getting closer, getting stronger. This is my gift. This is my curse. To never finish, to never rest, to drag others into the waiting. Chris's hand found something in his jacket pocket, a small glass bottle, holy water, pressed on him by his Catholic mother before he'd moved to Washington. He'd kept it as a joke, a talisman, a reminder of her superstitions. His rational mind had mocked it for 15 years. He threw it in the thing's face. The reaction was immediate and violent. Vaduva screamed, a sound that no human throat should produce, and recoiled. Where the water had touched, the skin bubbled and blackened. The thing stumbled backward, and Chris didn't wait to see more. He ran, sliding and falling down the trail, branches whipping his face, his lungs burning. The screaming followed him, echoing through the forest, until finally it faded into wind and distance. He reached the trailhead at 7:47 p.m., stumbling into the parking lot just as full darkness fell. His vehicle sat where he'd left it. Rachel's Subaru was gone. The two other vehicles remained, and he understood now what they represented. Not hikers who'd returned safely, hikers who never would. The Rangers found him collapsed against his truck, hypothermic and incoherent. They took him to the hospital in Cedro Woolley, treated him for exposure and dehydration. When he tried to tell them what he'd seen, they exchanged glances. When he insisted they search for the hanging bodies, they explained that they'd searched that area thoroughly over the years. There were no bodies. There was no grave marker. There was nothing but old forest and the accumulated fears of men who spent too long alone in the mountains. Chris was placed on administrative leave, mandatory psychological evaluation, possible PTSD. The official report listed Rachel Morrison as missing, presumed dead from exposure or a fall. Her body was never found. Chris's equipment failures were attributed to the weather. His testimony was described as confused and unreliable. He never returned to the North Cascades. He transferred to a desk job in Oregon, analyzing population data, never going into the field. But every August, he feels it. A cold spot in his office that shouldn't exist. A sensation of being watched. The smell of decay cutting through recycled air. And at night when he's alone, he sometimes sees a figure standing in his backyard, motionless, dressed in old climbing gear, watching his windows with white filmed eyes. The rational part of his mind, the part that spent 15 years building a career on evidence and data, insists it's trauma, PTSD, the mind's way of processing an experience it can't categorize. But Christopher Bennett knows better now. He knows there are things that exist outside measurement, outside logic, outside the comfortable boundaries of science. He knows that in the North Cascades, on a specific arm of a specific mountain, something ancient and hungry still walks, still waits, still adds to its collection. And he knows that Rachel Morrison is up there still, somewhere between alive and dead, waiting for the rituals that will never come, becoming something that future hikers will glimpse through fog and run from, screaming into radios that won't answer. The Strigoi are patient. They have eternity to hunt. And the mountain remembers. Hope you felt genuine terror. If you appreciate authentic horror rooted in real folklore, consider following for more stories. Which moment scared you most? Share your theory about what happened to Rachel. The coordinates came through dispatch at 14:47 on a Thursday afternoon, when the temperature had already climbed to 108 degrees. Daniel Carter was 3 miles into a routine patrol along the Idaho Mountain Drive, documenting saguaro blight patterns in his field notebook, when his Motorola radio crackled with the kind of static that meant someone was transmitting from deep in the monument's backcountry. "Carter, this is Base. We've got a welfare check request from University of Arizona. Graduate student, 26-year-old female Emily Sanderson. She was conducting field research near Alamo Canyon and missed 2 scheduled check-ins. Last known position was approximately 2 miles south of the Alamo Canyon trailhead. Vehicle located at the parking area, but no sign of the individual." Dan keyed his radio, already running through the protocols in his mind. Search and rescue procedures, timeline establishment, resource allocation. "Copy that. I'm 20 minutes from the trailhead. Has anyone made contact with the campsite?" "Negative. Forest Service requested we handle it since she's within monument boundaries. Her research advisor says she's experienced, not the type to wander off without communication." "Understood. I'll assess and report back within the hour." Dan had been with the National Park Service for 8 years, the last 4 at Oregon Pipe. He'd conducted 43 search and rescue operations in that time, and he'd developed a mental taxonomy for missing persons cases. There were the unprepared tourists who thought the Sonoran Desert was like a theme park and underestimated the heat. There were the migrants who crossed from Mexico and got turned around in the endless sameness of Creosote Flats. There were the elderly hikers who had medical emergencies. And then there were the statistical anomalies, the ones that didn't fit any pattern, the ones that made his reports read like fiction. This one already felt different. He reached the Alamo Canyon trailhead parking area 17 minutes later. A white Honda Civic with University of Arizona parking permit sat alone in the gravel lot, its hood cool to the touch. The interior was neat. A water bottle in the cup holder, a road atlas folded on the passenger seat, nothing to suggest panic or hurried departure. Dan circled the vehicle, noting details. No flat tires, doors locked, a thin layer of dust on the windshield consistent with 3 days of exposure. The temperature was beginning its slow evening decline, but it would be another 2 hours before the air became anything approaching comfortable. Dan loaded his pack with 4 liters of water, his first aid kit, his Garmin GPS unit, and his digital camera. He grabbed his clipboard and began filling out the initial incident report, his handwriting precise even in the heat. Subject Emily Sanderson, DOB 6/12/1988. Last known location, Alamo Canyon Research Site. Duration 72+ hours since last contact. Weather conditions, clear extreme heat advisory in effect. Terrain, high desert, elevation 1,800-2,400 feet, rocky washes, and saguaro forest. The trailhead register showed Emily's signature from Monday morning at 06:15. Her handwriting was confident, the kind of script that came from someone who took field notes regularly. E. Sanderson. Solo day hike and campsite check. Expect return by 18 But she hadn't returned. Dan followed the trail south into Alamo Canyon, his boots crunching on the decomposed granite that served as the path. The saguaros stood like sentinels, their arms raised in gestures that might have been surrender or worship. Oregon Pipe Cactus National Monument was one of the most remote protected areas in the Southwest, a stretch of Sonoran Desert that abutted the Mexican border and saw maybe 30,000 visitors a year. Most of those visitors never ventured beyond the scenic drive. Out here in the backcountry, you could walk for hours and see nothing but cactus, rock, and sky. The isolation was part of what Dan loved about the work. No crowds, no noise, just the clean simplicity of observation and documentation. He was a man who appreciated measurable phenomena, verifiable data, the kind of knowledge you could record in standardized forms. The desert made sense to him in a way that cities never had. Every plant had adapted to specific conditions. Every animal followed predictable patterns. Cause and effect. Input and output. He found Emily's campsite after 40 minutes of hiking, tucked into a sandy wash where a small grove of Palo Verde trees provided afternoon shade. The setup was professional. A lightweight tent staked securely against wind, a bare canister for food storage properly sealed, a camp stove and fuel organized on a flat rock. Solar panels were rigged to charge a battery pack. This was someone who knew what they were doing. But Emily herself was nowhere to be seen. Dan approached slowly, his eyes cataloging everything. The tent flap hung partially open. A sleeping bag lay half unzipped inside. A field journal rested on a folding chair, its pages fluttering slightly in the breath of wind that occasionally moved through the wash. He pulled out his camera and began documenting the scene, taking methodical photographs from multiple angles before he touched anything. The journal drew his attention first. It was open to an entry dated 3 days ago, the writing initially neat but becoming increasingly compressed toward the bottom of the page. Tuesday, 4/15/14, 1930 Har Saguaro census, complete for grid section D7. Documented 43 individuals, 12 showing signs of bacterial necrosis consistent with previous observations. Temperature peaked at 106 degrees Rao. Saw a coyote around 17 hour moving along the ridge to the east. Seemed to be tracking something, though I couldn't see any prey animals. It kept stopping and looking back at me. Odd behavior. Made me uncomfortable enough that I returned to camp earlier than planned. Something about the proportions seemed wrong. Too tall. The legs looked strange. Just the heat getting to me. Need to hydrate more. Dan frowned. He'd seen hundreds of coyotes in his years in the desert. They were typically wary of humans, rarely approaching close enough for detailed observation. He flipped back through earlier entries, finding dense notes on plant phenology, soil chemistry, and wildlife observations. Emily's research focused on climate adaptation in saguaro cacti populations near the monument's southern boundary. Serious academic work. Nothing frivolous. But the tone shifted in the later entries. Wednesday, 4/16/14, 07:59 hours, terrible sleep. Kept hearing something moving around the camp. Thought it might be javelinas. But the sounds were wrong. Footsteps almost, but with a strange rhythm. Fast, then slow. I got out of the tent twice with my flashlight, but didn't see anything. Coyote tracks near the wash, but they change. The sentence ended there, ink trailing off as if she'd been interrupted. The next entry was written in a noticeably less steady hand. Wednesday, 4/16/14, 22 ARs saw the coyote again. Or something that looked like a coyote from a distance. I was setting up my remote camera on the ridge and it appeared maybe 30 yards away. It sat there watching me for at least 5 minutes. I took photos. When I looked through the camera viewfinder, something about it seemed fundamentally wrong. The proportions, the way it held itself. And then it stood up. Not the way a coyote stretches into a standing position. It stood up like a person would stand up if they'd been crouching. On 2 legs. For just a moment, then it dropped back to 4 and moved away along the ridgeline. But the gait was wrong, like something imitating the movement without fully understanding the mechanics. I'm being irrational. Heat exhaustion affects perception and judgment. I've consumed adequate water. My urine is pale yellow. But I can't shake the feeling that something is watching me. That something has been watching me since I arrived. The tracks. I need to mention the tracks. I followed them this afternoon thinking I could identify the species definitively. They started as coyote prints, clear paw marks in the sand. But 30 feet along the wash they changed. The spacing altered. The depth became uneven. And then they weren't coyote prints anymore, they looked like handprints. Human handprints. But elongated with the fingers spread too wide. And then they went back to being coyote prints. I photographed them. The camera doesn't lie. Dan set the journal down carefully and looked around the campsite with fresh attention. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the wash, and somewhere in the distance, a cactus wren called out its harsh, rattling cry. He checked his watch. 16:35. Maybe 2.5 hours of good daylight remaining. He examined the ground around the tent, looking for the tracks Emily had described, but 3 days of wind had smoothed most of the details from the sandy surface. He found what might have been coyote prints near the wash's edge, but they were too degraded to tell him anything useful. The tent interior was orderly: sleeping bag, inflatable pad, a small stuff sack containing toiletries. Emily's research equipment was still here: a laptop in a protective case, GPS unit, multiple digital cameras, soil sampling containers. Her purse sat in the corner of the tent, phone inside. He pressed the power button and the screen lit up, 23% battery remaining, but there was no signal out here. The last attempted call had been Monday evening at 1847 to a contact labeled Dr. Reeves. It hadn't connected. No sign of struggle, no blood, no torn fabric or broken equipment. It was as if Emily had simply stood up and walked away from her camp in the middle of research work, leaving everything behind. Dan spent the next hour conducting a grid search of the area within a quarter-mile radius of the campsite. He moved methodically, his eyes scanning the ground for any trace of passage. He found a few scuff marks on rocks, some disturbed gravel, but nothing that formed a coherent trail. The desert was good at hiding things. It was good at erasing evidence. Wind and sun were better than any cleaning crew. As the light began to fail, Dan made the decision to establish his own camp nearby and resume the search at first light. He radioed base with his status update, requesting additional SAR personnel for the morning. Then he set up his tent 20 yards from Emily's, arranged his gear, and ate an MRE while reviewing the photos on Emily's cameras. Most of the images were mundane scientific documentation, saguaros from multiple angles, close-ups of bacterial infections, landscape shots for context. But then he reached the photos from Wednesday afternoon, and his methodical chewing slowed. The first image showed a coyote on a ridge, maybe 40 yards distant. Normal enough, though the animal did seem oddly proportioned, the legs slightly too long for the body. The next photo was zoomed in, and Dan found himself staring at it for a long time. The coyote was looking directly at the camera, its eyes catching the light in a way that created 2 bright circles. But there was something in its posture, in the way it held its head, that registered as wrong in some deep pattern recognition part of his brain that evolution had honed for spotting predators. The third photo showed the animal mid-transformation, or that's how his irrational mind wanted to interpret it. Logically, it was just motion blur from the camera's shutter, the coyote captured in an awkward moment of movement. But the blur suggested a form that was neither canine nor human, but something horrible in between. Elongated limbs, a torso that seemed too upright. Dan deleted the thought before it could fully form. Heat shimmer, motion blur, pareidolia, the human tendency to see patterns and faces in random visual data. Emily had been out here alone for days in extreme heat. Isolation and temperature stress could produce unusual perceptual experiences. There were documented cases of solo hikers experiencing auditory and visual hallucinations in desert environments. But then there were the track photos. Emily had been thorough, documenting a sequence of prints in fine sand near the wash. Dan zoomed in on his camera's LCD screen, studying each image. The tracks did appear to change. Canine paw prints transitioned into something that looked disturbingly like elongated human hands pressed palm down in the sand, fingers splayed, then back to paw prints. The transitions happened over the span of perhaps 10 feet. He checked the metadata. The photos were taken Wednesday at 14:22, less than 48 hours ago. The wind would have erased them by now, but they'd been real when Emily documented them. Dan's training insisted on rational explanations, multiple animals crossing the same path, unusual erosion patterns creating misleading impressions, but his training also insisted on thorough investigation, and that meant considering all evidence, even evidence that made him uncomfortable. He pulled out Emily's journal again and continued reading by the light of his headlamp. Thursday, 4/17/14, 03:30 RRs woke to the sound of my own voice calling from outside the tent. I was dreaming, had to be dreaming, but I heard myself saying, "Emily, come out here. Emily, you need to see this." The voice was perfect, my exact inflection, my Midwestern vowels. But I was in the tent, sleeping bag zipped up to my chin, and that voice was coming from somewhere near the wash. I didn't go out. I stayed frozen in my sleeping bag until the sun came up. When I finally got the courage to look, there were tracks circling my tent, dozens of them. Different species: coyote, javelina, jackrabbit, even what looked like deer tracks, though there are no deer in this part of the monument, all circling, around and around, like something had been pacing while trying on different shapes. I know how insane this sounds. There are legends. I've heard them. When I was doing preliminary research, a man at the gas station in Y looked at my maps and asked where I was camping. When I told him Alamo Canyon, his face changed. He said there were areas near the border that the Tohono O'odham don't go, places where... He used a word I didn't understand. Later I looked it up. Yi Naldlushi, skinwalker. Navajo legend, but similar beliefs exist across indigenous cultures in the Southwest. A witch who has violated sacred taboos. Someone who has killed a close relative to gain the power of dark transformation. They can wear the skin of any animal. They can imitate any voice. But that's folklore. That's cultural mythology used to reinforce social norms and explain unusual phenomena. That's not real. Except I keep thinking about those tracks. About that voice. About the way the coyote stood up. I'm leaving in the morning. I've documented enough data. There's no reason to stay out here alone. The journal ended there. Whatever had happened next, Emily hadn't written it down. Dan sat in his tent as full darkness fell over Organ Pipe Cactus National Monument. And for the first time in his career, he felt something he had always dismissed in others. The prickle of genuine unease that had nothing to do with rational risk assessment. The desert night was never silent. Insects chirped. Small mammals rustled through brush. The temperature differential caused rocks to contract with audible cracks. But he found himself listening to each sound with hypervigilance, trying to categorize it, trying to assign it a known source. At 22:15, he heard footsteps. They were distant, perhaps 30 yards away, moving along the edge of the wash. The rhythm was wrong. Too slow, too deliberate. Dan grabbed his high-lumen flashlight and unzipped his tent, sweeping the beam across the landscape. The light caught creosote bushes, the pale trunks of palo verde, the corrugated forms of saguaros, but nothing moving. The footsteps stopped when the light came on. Dan stood outside his tent in the cone of his flashlight beam, aware that he was making himself a visible target, aware that this was tactically stupid, but unable to simply lie in his tent while something paced around his camp. His Glock 22 was holstered on his belt, standard NPS issue, carried for dangerous wildlife and the occasional armed smuggler crossing from Mexico. But he didn't draw it. What would he shoot? Shadows? Emily? He called out. Emily Sanderson, if you can hear me, I'm a park ranger. I'm here to help you. Your research advisor reported you missing. His voice carried in the dry air, echoing slightly off the canyon walls. No response came. But somewhere out in the darkness, maybe 50 yards away now, something moved. He caught it in his peripheral vision, a shape that slipped between two saguaros with a fluidity that seemed wrong for the terrain. Dan's radio crackled with static, making him jump. No voice came through, just a wash of white noise that lasted for 5 seconds and then cut off. He looked down at the device clipped to his shoulder. The display showed full battery, but the signal indicator wavered between 1 bar and none. He swept his flashlight across the desert again, methodically this time, covering sectors the way he'd been trained. Nothing. No eye shine from animals, no reflection from gear, no movement. But the feeling of being watched had intensified to the point where it manifested as physical sensation, a pressure against his chest that made breathing slightly difficult. Dan retreated to his tent and spent the rest of the night in fitful alertness, his flashlight in one hand listening. Around 03 ASO, he heard his own voice outside the tent. Dan Carter, come out here. I found her. I found Emily. The voice was perfect. His own Kentucky accent, flattened by years away from home but still present in certain vowels. The cadence he used when speaking officially, ranger to civilian. He lay in his sleeping bag, his heart performing gymnastics in his chest, and said nothing. Dan, she's alive. She's hurt, but she's alive. I need your help to carry her back. He grabbed his radio. Base, this is Carter. I have a possible 10-33 repeat emergency situation at my location. Request immediate backup and helicopter extraction. Coordinates. He rattled off his GPS position. The voice outside the tent changed. It laughed. And the laugh started in his voice but shifted mid-sound into something else. Something that scraped against his hearing like audio feedback. Like the death scream of a rabbit being torn apart by a coyote. Like wind through a dead tree. Like nothing he could properly name. Then silence. Dawn took an eternity to arrive, and when it finally did, Dan emerged from his tent to find tracks everywhere. Coyote prints, javelina prints, even the dragging trails that sidewinders left in sand. They circled both tents in complex overlapping patterns, and in several places the tracks transitioned mid-stride from animal to something else. Something with elongated digits that pressed deep into the sand. Something that had walked on 2 legs and then dropped to 4 and then back to 2, as if the walker couldn't decide which form to wear. Dan photographed everything with methodical precision, falling back on procedure because procedure was the only thing keeping his mind from following Emily's journal entries down a path his rational worldview couldn't accommodate. He measured the tracks. He took scale photos with his ruler. He documented the spatial relationships and the transition points. The evidence was undeniable, and it denied everything he understood about mammalian locomotion and forensic tracking. His radio crackled. Carter, this is Base. Did you just call for emergency extraction? Affirmative. I called at approximately 03:15 hours. We have no record of that transmission. Your radio didn't go active until just now. Dan looked at his radio, then at the track circling his tent, then at the brightening sky where a helicopter should have been converging on his position. Understood. Consider this my official request. I need SAR personnel and a helicopter at my coordinates as soon as possible. We have a missing person situation with complications. Define complications. He stared at the tracks, at the impossible transitions, at the evidence that Emily Sanderson had not been delusional or heat-stressed, but had instead encountered something that existed outside the framework of his carefully maintained scientific worldview. Possible wildlife hazard. Unusual predator behavior. I'll provide full details in my report. The helicopter arrived 90 minutes later, bringing 3 additional rangers and a search dog. Dan briefed them on Emily's disappearance, on the campsite evidence, on the timeline, but he found himself editing his language, removing references to anything that sounded too strange. Unusual tracks became possible coyote activity. The voice in the night became auditory distortion in canyon acoustics. But when Travis Morrison, a ranger he'd worked with for 3 years, examined the track photos on Dan's camera, his expression shifted into something Dan recognized. The look of someone encountering evidence that contradicted their understanding of reality. You seeing what I'm seeing in these photos? Travis asked quietly, away from the others. Tell me what you're seeing, Dan said. Tracks that change. Coyote to something else. To something that shouldn't exist. Travis looked up at the surrounding canyon walls, the saguaro standing sentinel on the ridges, the endless undulation of desert stretching toward Mexico. You know what the O-Autumn call this area? The burned place. There are stories about why, old stories, stories about things that walk wearing skins that don't belong to them. Dan wanted to dismiss it. He wanted to explain everything through rational mechanisms, heat distortion, tracking errors, misidentification, but he'd spent the night listening to his own voice calling from outside his tent, and he'd seen the track circling in the morning light, and somewhere in his chest, the careful architecture of his skepticism had developed cracks. The search expanded. They covered 5 square miles over the next 2 days, using GPS coordinates and systematic grid patterns. The dog picked up Emily's scent trail leading south from camp, following it for almost a mile before losing it at a rocky outcropping, where tracks became impossible to follow. They found nothing else. No gear, no clothing, no physical evidence of what had happened to her. But they all heard things at night, voices calling in the darkness, footsteps that stopped when flashlights activated, And twice, rangers on opposite sides of the search grid reported seeing figures moving on the ridge lines, figures that disappeared when approached, figures that moved with a gait that registered as fundamentally wrong. On the third night, Dan was manning base camp alone while the others bivouacked at the far extent of the search grid. He sat in a folding chair under a battery-powered lamp, updating his incident report on his laptop, when he became aware of a presence at the edge of the light. An elderly man stood there, appearing so suddenly and silently that Dan's hand went instinctively to his holstered pistol. But the man made no threatening movement. He was Tohono O'Odham, Dan thought, or perhaps from one of the other tribes that had historical ties to this land. He wore jeans and a faded blue work shirt, his face creased with decades of desert sun. "You're searching for the girl," the man said. It wasn't a question. "Yes." "Did you see her? Do you have information about Emily Sanderson?" The man stepped closer into the circle of lamplight, and his eyes were dark and ancient and sad. "She walked into a cursed place. She didn't know. How could she? Your people don't believe in such things. You think the desert is empty, that it follows your rules. But there are beings here older than your government, older than your national monuments and boundary lines, things that were here before the Spanish came, before even my people came, things that learned to hunt when humans were still learning to make fire." Dan's rational mind wanted to reject this, but his rational mind had spent 3 nights hearing his own voice calling from the darkness, and something in him had broken open enough to listen. "What is it?" he asked. "What took her?" "Ye nald lushi." You would call it a skinwalker, but that word doesn't carry the weight. It's not just a shapeshifter. It's a human who chose to become something worse than human, who killed family to gain dark power. The transformation corrupts everything: body, mind, spirit. They can wear animal skins, take animal shapes, but they're not animals. They're predators who understand human thought because they used to be human. They know what frightens us. They know how to use our voices. They hunt in places like this, where few people come, where disappearances are easy. "Why?" Dan heard himself ask. "Why Emily? Why anyone?" "Because they're hungry, not for meat. They've moved beyond physical hunger. They're hungry for the fear, for the corruption, for the violation of making someone understand that reality is not what they thought it was. And because this is their territory, the burned place. There was a man here once, many generations ago, who broke the worst taboos. The Odom tried to kill him, but he escaped into the desert and used forbidden knowledge to transform himself. He's been here ever since, wearing different shapes, claiming anyone foolish enough to camp alone in his hunting ground." Dan looked at his laptop screen, at his half-completed report with its careful language about possible coyote activity and unidentified tracks. "Can it be stopped? Can it be killed?" "Yes, but you would need to find its true form, its original body. It would be hidden somewhere, probably in a cave or crevice preserved through dark means. Destroy that and you destroy the creature. But finding it..." The old man shook his head. "The desert is vast, and it knows when it's being hunted. It will hunt you instead." "What about Emily? Is she..." "Gone. Taken into its collection. The skinwalker doesn't always kill immediately. Sometimes it keeps them, transforms them slowly, teaches them its hunger. Either way, she's not the person she was. If you find her now, you won't be saving her. You'll be finding something that wears her shape." The old man turned to leave, melting back into the darkness beyond the lamp's reach. "Wait," Dan called. "How do you know all this? How can you be sure?" The man's voice came from the darkness, disembodied now. "Because I was there when we tried to kill him the first time. That was 63 years ago. I was 19. We thought we succeeded. We burned his Hogan, shot him, left him for dead in the desert. But 3 weeks later we heard him calling to us in our own voices. We learned to stay away from the burned place. We tried to warn others, but your people don't listen to old stories." Dan sat alone at his lamplit camp for a long time after the man disappeared, staring at his laptop screen, at the official language of his report, at the framework of rationality that had governed his entire adult life. He could write what was expected. Missing person, Unknown cause. Search continuing. He could use the proper codes and check the appropriate boxes and file a report that would make sense in the official record. Or he could write the truth. His fingers hovered over the keyboard. In the darkness surrounding his island of light, something moved. He heard the footsteps, heard the breathing, heard the slight shuffle of limbs adjusting position. Watching, always watching, waiting to see what he would do. How he would classify this experience, whether he would break like Emily had broken. Dan closed his laptop. He wouldn't finish the report tonight. Maybe he wouldn't finish it at all. The next morning, the search was officially suspended. 4 days, 5 square miles, no trace of Emily Sanderson beyond her abandoned camp, and her journal full of observations that Dan had carefully not included in any official documentation. The university would hire private search teams. The family would hold out hope. Eventually, she would join the statistics. Another person who walked into wilderness and didn't walk out. Another mystery in a desert full of mysteries. Dan returned to his regular duties, filing reports on saguaro health and trail maintenance and visitor safety protocols. But he stopped doing solo backcountry patrols. He started wearing a medicine bag that a Tohono O'odham woman sold him at a roadside stand, ignoring her knowing look when he asked what it protected against. He began keeping Emily's journal in his truck's glove compartment, taking it out occasionally to reread her observations, to study the progression from scientific confidence to dawning horror. And sometimes, on the clearest nights, he drove out to the Alamo Canyon trailhead and stood in the parking lot where Emily's Honda Civic had waited for its owner to return. He would look south into the darkness of the monument's backcountry, toward the burned place, and he would listen. Once, 3 months after Emily disappeared, he heard someone calling his name from deep in the canyon. The voice was hers. Perfect inflection, perfect tone. The slight hesitation before the hard consonant that had been captured in the recording of her advisor check-in call. Dan Carter. I found the way back. I found what you're looking for. Come help me. He stood at the trailhead with his flashlight off, his hand on his holstered weapon, and he didn't move. The voice called for 15 minutes, growing more insistent, more desperate, more perfectly Emily with each iteration. Then it stopped, and in the silence that followed, he heard something else. Laughter that wasn't human, that had never been human, that remembered being human, but had chosen to become something worse. Dan got back in his truck and drove away. He submitted his resignation to the National Park Service 2 weeks later. The official reason was personal matters. The real reason was that he couldn't patrol a wilderness where reality bent in ways his training hadn't prepared him for, where the scientific method failed to explain phenomena that broke every rule of natural law, where every rustle in the brush might be something wearing the wrong skin. His replacement was a bright, enthusiastic recent graduate from Colorado State University with a degree in ecology and a passion for desert conservation. Dan met her briefly during the transition, taught her the radio codes and the GPS waypoints and the location of reliable water sources. He thought about warning her. He thought about showing her Emily's journal, about explaining what walked in the burned place. But he didn't. How could he? He'd sound insane. And maybe, it was a singular encounter. Maybe the skinwalker had fed and would sleep for years. Maybe the odds of another person camping solo in that specific area were low enough that it didn't matter. Or maybe he was just a coward who couldn't bear to see someone else's face when they realized that the world contained things that shouldn't exist. Dan moved to Tucson, took a job with the city parks department maintaining urban trails where the worst threats were mountain bikes going too fast and the occasional rattlesnake. He dated a teacher, broke up with her when she suggested a camping trip to Organ Pipe. He started seeing a therapist but never told her the real reason for his anxiety dreams. He functioned, he adapted, he survived. But on nights when the wind blew from the south, carrying the smell of creosote and heated stone, he would stand on his apartment balcony and think about Emily Sanderson, 26 years old, bright and capable, who had walked into the desert with scientific instruments and rigorous methodology, and had discovered that empiricism has limits, that there are questions the scientific method can't answer, that some phenomena don't care about your epistemology. He thought about her journal, still in his glove compartment, pages documenting the transition from confidence to doubt to terror. He thought about her voice calling from the darkness. He thought about tracks that changed shape mid-stride. He thought about an old man who claimed to be 90 years old but looked 60, who had tried to kill a monster when he was 19 and failed, who had spent the rest of his life watching it hunt. And sometimes, not often, but sometimes, Dan would hear footsteps outside his apartment. He would hear his own voice calling from the parking lot. He would see shadows move wrong in his peripheral vision. And he would sit very still, with all his lights on, because he understood now that the desert was patient, that some hunters tracked their prey across vast distances, that some things didn't forget the ones who got away. Emily Sanderson was never found. Her case remains open with the National Park Service, coded as a probable heat-related death with remains yet to be recovered. The official record is neat, explainable, rational. Dan Carter knows better. He knows the official record is a comfortable fiction. He knows Emily found something in the burned place that exists outside the framework of what his government acknowledges. He knows she either died screaming or became something worse than dead, and he knows that someday when he's old and thinks he's safe, something will call to him in her voice and he'll have to decide whether to answer or spend the rest of his life wondering if this time it was really her. The desert keeps its secrets, and sometimes the secrets hunt. Hope you felt genuine terror. If you appreciate authentic horror rooted in real folklore, consider following for more stories. Which moment scared you most? Share your theory about what happened to Emily. Derek Holloway had learned to ignore the feeling years ago, that electric wrongness that crawled up his spine when something unseen watched from the tree line. As a child, his grandmother had called it the gift, but Derek called it a liability. Rangers dealt in facts, GPS coordinates, weather patterns, topographical maps, not the prickling sensation that currently raised the hairs on his forearms as he stood on the Mineral Creek Trail, staring at the abandoned backpack half buried in sword ferns. October rain fell in sheets through the Hoh rainforest canopy, turning everything into a watercolor of moss green and shadow. Derek's Motorola MTS 2000 crackled with static as he keyed the mic. Station, this is Ranger Holloway. I've got a possible abandoned pack at coordinates N47 Dig 5123, W123 Dig 56 C18, trail marker 7.3, requesting database check on recent permits. The response came through garbled. Olympic National Park's western edge was notorious for dead zones, and the ancient Sitka spruces, some over 300 feet tall, didn't help radio transmission. Derek released the transmit button and crouched beside the pack, pulling on latex gloves from his belt kit. The wrongness intensified, not just concern for a potentially lost hiker. Derek had handled dozens of those. This felt deeper, older, like the forest itself was holding its breath. He pushed the sensation down, focusing on procedure. The pack was a standard REI model, dark blue, relatively new. No visible damage. He checked the exterior pockets first, finding a laminated permit dated 3 days prior. Hannah Mitchell, age 22, University of Washington. Research permit for botanical sampling. Solo hiker, solo, in October, in the Hoh. Derek's jaw tightened. He'd seen too many recoveries that started with solo hiker. The second pocket yielded a Nalgene bottle, half full, and a soggy field notebook with a green cover. He opened it carefully. The ink had run in places, but Hannah Mitchell's handwriting was precise, almost obsessive. Pages of botanical sketches, Devil's Club, Pacific U, Western Hemlock, normal enough. But the final entries made Derek's stomach clench. October 12th, 2007. Found it. The grove isn't on any modern maps, but the 1889 survey mentions Settlers' Sanctuary, 5 acres cleared by Romanian immigrants. Dr. Carson was right about the European medicinal traditions persisting in isolated communities. The protection plants are all here. Garlic mustard, Aliaria petiolata, growing in unnatural abundance, wild roses forming a barrier around the perimeter, hawthorn trees in deliberate placement. This isn't random distribution. This is intentional. October 13th. Local ranger, older guy, station chief, tried to turn me away from this area, said it's bad luck ground. When I pressed him, he got uncomfortable and mentioned old superstitions from the homesteaders, asked if I was alone, the way he looked at me. October 14th. The soil samples are wrong. pH should be 5.56.00 in this area, testing at 8.2 near the center of the grove. That's not natural, and the protection ring is breaking down. The hawthorn is diseased, roses are dying back, whatever they were protecting against. The entry ended mid-sentence. Derek's radio crackled. Allaway, database shows, Mitchell, checked in October 11th, overdue, SAR protocol. Station, you're breaking up. Confirm SAR activation? More static than a fragment. Team assembles 0600, continue. Derek stood, the notebook in his hands feeling heavier than it should. Hannah Mitchell had been missing for 6 days. In this weather, with overnight temperatures dropping to 40 degrees, hypothermia was almost certain. But the wrongness Derek felt wasn't about hypothermia. It was about what she'd been looking for, and what she might have found. He pulled out his Garmin eTrex GPS unit, marking the location of the backpack. The device flickered, losing satellite lock for a moment before reconnecting. Derek frowned. The canopy was thick, but he'd never had this much trouble with signal in this area. He started a spiral search pattern, moving outward from the pack in widening circles, scanning for footprints, broken vegetation, anything. 50 yards northeast, he found the first marker, a small cairn of stones, deliberately stacked, with a sprig of dried flowers wedged between the rocks. The flowers were brittle with age, but Derek recognized the species, wild rose, browning but intact. He marked it on his GPS and continued. 3 more cairns forming a rough square around what must have been Hannah's settler's sanctuary. And in the center, partially hidden by a fallen cedar, Derek saw the grove. The wrongness became a scream in his mind. The space was roughly circular, maybe 60 feet across. The trees that should have filled it were stunted, twisted, their bark blackened as if from old fire. But there had been no fire. Derek had studied the park's burn records. Nothing in this sector for over a century. The ground was bare earth, packed hard, with that same unnatural ring of dying protective plants Hannah had documented. And in the very center stood something that made Derek's breath catch. A stone. Not a boulder. A carved marker, rectangular, about 4 feet tall. The inscriptions were weathered almost smooth, but Derek could make out letters in an alphabet he didn't recognize. At the base of the stone, someone had placed offerings. Moldering flowers, a small bottle of what looked like oil, and, Derek's stomach turned, a dead crow, its body unnaturally preserved despite obvious age. His grandmother's voice echoed in memory. When the dead won't rest, Derek, the land remembers, and the land tells those who can listen. Derek had spent 35 years not listening. He pulled out his digital camera, a decent Nikon D40 he'd bought specifically for documentation, and began photographing the scene. Through the viewfinder, the wrongness intensified. The stone seemed to shift in the frame, never quite where he aimed. Derek lowered the camera, blinking. When he raised it again, the stone was motionless. His cell phone, a relatively new Motorola Razr that worked maybe half the time in the park, showed no signal. He tried the radio again. Pure static. Derek marked the location on his GPS, then began a perimeter search. If Hannah had been here, she would have left traces. He found them at the northeastern edge. Fresh broken branches, crushed ferns, and a single boot print in soft earth. The print pointed away from the grove toward the deeper forest where Mineral Creek became a series of waterfalls and box canyons. The terrain there was dangerous even in good weather. In October rain, it was potentially lethal. Derek should have called it in, waited for the SAR team. Protocol demanded it, but the light was failing, and something in his gut, that damned gift he'd tried to bury, was screaming that time mattered. Not search and rescue time, something else. He followed the trail. The prints became harder to track as the undergrowth thickened. Derek moved carefully, his maglite cutting through the premature dusk created by the canopy. The sound of rushing water grew louder. Mineral Creek, swollen with rain, and beneath that sound, something else. A voice? No. Voices. Multiple. Speaking in a rhythm that sounded almost like chanting. Derek froze. His radio crackled spontaneously, a burst of interference that resolved into something that might have been words in a language he didn't know. Then silence. The voices continued clearer now. They were coming from ahead near the creek. Derek moved toward them, each step careful, his mind cataloging details the way he'd been trained. Time, 1734. Location, approximately 400 yards northeast of Stone Marker. Weather, heavy rain, visibility less than 50 feet. His condition, elevated heart rate, that wrongness now a physical pressure in his chest. Through the ferns, he saw light. Not flashlight, candlelight, maybe a dozen sources, flickering in the rain. Impossible rain or not, the flames burned. Derek dropped to a crouch, moving closer. The voices resolved into words. Not English, not Spanish. Something Eastern European, the syllables harsh and rolling. Derek's limited linguistic knowledge, picked up from decades of international park visitors, suggested Romanian, maybe Bulgarian. And the tone was wrong. Not hikers singing around a campfire. This was ritual. He reached the edge of a small clearing beside the creek. What he saw made every rational thought freeze. 7 figures in dark clothing stood in a circle around a prone form. The form was too still, too small. Deer, Derek's mind supplied. They killed a deer. But as his eyes adjusted, he saw pale skin, blonde hair matted with mud and blood. Human. Not Hannah. This body was older, the flesh partially decomposed despite the cold that should have preserved it. One of the standing figures raised something, a hammer and a wooden stake, and brought it down with a wet, meaty sound that made Derek's gorge rise. The body twitched, not post-mortem muscle spasm. The thing on the ground moved deliberately, trying to rise despite the stake now pinning it through the chest. Its head turned toward Derek, and he saw its face in the candlelight. A man, maybe 70, with eyes that reflected the flames like an animal's. The mouth opened, revealing teeth filed to points, and it made a sound between a hiss and a scream. The 7 figures reacted instantly. 3 of them turned toward Derek's position, and he saw their faces. Older people, 60s and 70s, weathered by outdoor life. One woman held a string of garlic bulbs. Another man gripped a knife with symbols carved into the handle. They didn't look afraid. They looked determined. "Who watches?" The woman with the garlic called out in heavily accented English. "Show yourself or share his fate." Derek's training screamed at him to identify himself, to take control of the situation. But his gift, that cursed sensitivity he'd tried to ignore, told him that any movement would be fatal. These people believed they were fighting something, and they would kill anyone they perceived as a threat. The thing pinned to the ground screamed again, and the sound triggered something primal in Derek's hindbrain. He turned and ran. Behind him, the chanting resumed, louder, more frantic. Derek crashed through the undergrowth, his mind refusing to process what he'd seen. A stake through the chest, movement after death, teeth filed to points. This was madness, except Hannah's notebook had mentioned protection rituals, European traditions brought by Romanian settlers. And Strigoi, Derek's grandmother, had told him stories, the ones her own grandmother had brought from the old country. Vampiric revenants, intelligent and malevolent, rising from improper burials to torment the living. Folk tales, superstition, not real, not possible. But Derek had seen it move. He ran until his lungs burned, until the sounds behind him faded into the rush of water and wind. When he finally stopped, gasping, he checked his GPS. The device showed his position, but the track log was corrupted, showing impossible loops and backtracking he hadn't made. He was 2 miles from the Stone Marker. It had felt like 100 yards. His radio hissed to life. "Ranger Holloway, status, SAR team, station." Derek keyed the mic, fighting to control his breathing. Station, I've got a situation. Multiple individuals engaged in... I need backup at... He read off his coordinates. Repeat. Coordinates invalid. That sector. Prohibited. Dangerous terrain. Station, listen to me. There's a body. There are people performing some kind of ritual. I need... The radio squealed, a sound like metal tearing, and went dead. Derek stared at the device. The display was dark. He pressed the power button. Nothing. The battery had been fully charged 2 hours ago. His GPS flickered and died. Then his maglite. Derek stood in the gathering darkness, rain hammering down, and felt that wrongness expand into something that had a name. Terror. Not the adrenaline of a dangerous rescue. Not the concern of finding a body. This was the pure animal fear of being hunted. Something moved in the trees to his left. Derek's eyes strained against the darkness. The movement came again. Too fluid to be human. Too deliberate to be animal. A shape detached from the shadows, no, two shapes, moving parallel to him about 30 yards out, flanking him. He walked faster, not quite running, his hand moving to the canister of bear spray on his belt. Against a black bear or cougar, the spray was his best defense. Against whatever those things were, don't think it. Don't give it power. But his grandmother's voice was there in his mind. The Strigoi hunt in groups, Derek. They're clever. They'll separate you from help, from light, from hope. And then they'll feed. Fuck that, Derek muttered aloud, and the sound of his own voice was absurdly comforting. He was a National Park Service ranger with 15 years' experience. He'd dealt with everything from aggressive wildlife to armed poachers. He was not going to be terrorized by... The scream cut through the forest, high and agonized and unmistakably human. Female. Hannah. Derek ran toward the sound without thinking. Every piece of training said it was a trap, but if there was any chance she was alive... The scream came again, ahead and to the right. Derek crashed through undergrowth, his night-adjusted eyes barely managing to avoid the larger trees. A break in the canopy showed roiling clouds and the last bloody light of sunset. The scream became words. Help me. Oh God, please, someone help me. Derek burst into a small clearing and saw her. A young woman in muddy jeans and a torn University of Washington sweatshirt. Blonde hair wild around her face, backing away from something at the clearing's edge. She turned toward him and her face was Hannah's from the permit photo. 22, terrified, alive. Please. She reached toward him. It's been chasing me for days, I can't... Derek saw it then. The thing emerging from the trees behind her. Man-shaped but wrong. The proportions subtly off. Too tall. Arms too long. It wore the remnants of clothing from another era. Homespun wool. Rotted leather. Its face was gray, skin pulled tight over the skull, and its eyes caught what little light remained with that same animal shine. The Strigoi opened its mouth and Derek saw the teeth. Run! Derek yanked Hannah toward him, already turning, his hand closing on the bear spray. The canister came up and he depressed the trigger, spraying behind them as they ran. The Strigoi shrieked, actually shrieked, a sound like metal scraping bone, but kept coming. They ran through the forest, Hannah sobbing beside him. Derek's mind was white noise and survival instinct. Find shelter, find light, find... Hannah stumbled and Derek caught her arm, pulling her upright. Her skin was ice cold even through the sleeve of her sweatshirt. She looked up at him, and in that moment Derek's gift screamed. Her eyes were wrong, the pupils too large, the whites too white. Thank you, Hannah whispered, and smiled. Her teeth had been filed to points. Derek threw himself backward as she lunged, her fingers, no claws, raking across his chest. The ranger uniform shirt tore but held. Derek hit the ground hard, rolled, came up with his radio in his hand, swinging it like a club. It connected with Hannah's temple and she staggered back, hissing. No, 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 no. Derek scrambled backward. You're dead. She's dead. This isn't... She is alive, Hannah said, but her voice was wrong now, layered with something older and colder. As you will be. The master woke hungry, Ranger. The old protections failed. and now we grow. 3 more shapes emerged from the trees. The thing Derek had seen before, and 2 others, decomposing bodies in newer clothing, one still wearing a backpack, 4 victims. Hannah had written about 4 disappearances over 80 years. "Join us," one of the older Strigoi said. Its voice was a dry rasp. "Or feed us. Either way, you don't leave this forest." Derek's hand found his belt knife, a 4-inch fixed blade he'd carried for 15 years. Against 4 revenants, it was laughable. But his grandmother had told him the old ways. Silver didn't matter. Holy water was Hollywood. What mattered was the heart, Derek said, or decapitation and burial at a crossroads. The Strigoi smiled in unison, a gesture so synchronized it made Derek's stomach lurch. The old hunter knew, the oldest Strigoi said. He and his circle. They kept us bound for decades. But time claims all flesh. Now only 2 remain, and they are so very old. It took a step closer. We took them tonight, fed as they tried their rituals. Soon we will take the whole park ranger. So many hikers, so many meals, so much time to grow our family. Hannah, the thing wearing Hannah's face, tilted her head. "You feel the darkness, don't you? I can sense it in you. The gift of sight. Join us willingly, and you'll keep that gift. We could use a sensitive. The Master especially values those who see." "The Master?" Derek's voice came out steadier than he felt. "Under the stone," Hannah whispered. "Buried there in 1889 by the settlers who knew what he was. But he never truly died, and now his protections crumble, and he wakes, and we rise with him." The pieces clicked together in Derek's mind with horrifying clarity. The Romanian settlers, the protection grove, the carved stone, not a memorial, but a grave marker, a seal, and something beneath it, old and patient and finally free after more than a century of imprisonment. "How many?" Derek asked, buying time, his mind racing through impossible calculations. "How many of you are there?" "Tonight? 5 of us, the forfeit and the Master." The oldest Strigoi's smile widened. "Tomorrow? Perhaps 6 after you." They circled him, and Derek knew he had seconds. His knife was useless. His spray was empty. His radio and GPS were dead. But there was one thing. He still had his lighter. And the Hoh rainforest, despite 140 inches of annual rainfall, had pockets of old-growth Douglas fir whose trunks could burn if you knew where to look. The dead-standing timber, the nurse logs so dry inside they crumbled to dust. Derek ran, not toward the trail, toward civilization, toward the stone, toward the grove. Behind him, the Strigoi gave chase, their movements inhumanly fast. But Derek had been running these trails for 15 years. Even in darkness, even in terror, he knew the way. He burst into the clearing with its ring of dying protective plants and ran straight to the stone. Up close, he could see the inscriptions more clearly, protection wards in Romanian, symbols that matched the ones in Hannah's notebook. And at the base, recently disturbed soil where something had clawed its way out from beneath. Derek dropped to his knees and began digging with his hands, tearing at the earth. 2 feet down, his fingers hit wood, a coffin lid, rotted but intact. He pulled his knife and jammed it into the gap, prying upward. The wood splintered. The Strigoi reached the clearing's edge and stopped, hissing. They wouldn't enter. The protections, weakened as they were, still held some power. "Foolish," the oldest one said. "You only trap yourself." Derek ignored it, tearing away chunks of rotted wood. The coffin interior was empty. The Master had already risen. But Derek wasn't looking for a body. He was looking for, there, tucked into the coffin's lining, a leather bag. Derek grabbed it, dumping the contents onto the ground. Dried herbs, a small bottle of oil, a wooden stake, hand-carved, symbols burned into its length, and a journal, its pages yellowed and brittle. Derek opened the journal to the last entry. The handwriting was shaky, ancient. August 13th, 1889. "We have bound the creature. Stefan Vasile, the one who brought the curse from the old country, lies in this grave with stakes of hawthorn through his heart and ash in his mouth. The protection circle will hold so long as the plants remain. My sons know the rituals. They will teach their sons. This evil must never wake. But I fear. Stefan spoke as we laid him down. He said eternity is patient. He said the blood calls to blood, and one day the protections will fail. He laughed as we sealed him. God forgive us if he was right. Derek looked up. Hannah's face peered at him from beyond the protective circle, her expression hungry. You can't stop us, she said. The master feeds. We grow strong. Your walls of garlic and prayers mean nothing now. Maybe not, Derek said, pulling out his lighter. But I can send him back. He flicked the lighter, touching the flame to the journal's pages. They caught immediately, old paper flaring bright. Derek dropped the burning book into the coffin, adding the dried herbs. The oil bottle he smashed against the wood, the contents spreading. Fire bloomed, yellow and hungry. The Strigoi shrieked in unison, their voices blending into a sound that made Derek's ears ring. Hannah's face contorted, the beauty sliding away to reveal something skull-like beneath. No, the master, he will know, he will punish. The fire spread down into the grave, into the earth itself. And from below, a scream that wasn't quite sound, more like pressure in Derek's skull. The master, trapped between death and unlife, feeling the flame consume whatever remained of his physical anchor. The Strigoi collapsed, all four of them hitting the ground simultaneously, their bodies convulsed, flesh rippling as if something beneath the skin was trying to escape. Hannah looked up at Derek one last time, and for a moment, he saw the real her, the 22-year-old botany student, terrified and trapped inside this thing she'd become. I'm sorry, Derek whispered. Then Hannah's body stilled, and the light went out of her eyes. The fire burned through the night. Derek sat beside it, feeding the flames with broken branches from the protective ring, watching the four bodies slowly decompose at an accelerated rate. By dawn, they were little more than bones and scraps of clothing. His radio crackled to life at 6:15 a.m. Ranger Holloway, this is Station. Say our team is mobilizing. What's your status? Derek stared at the radio for a long moment. Then he keyed the mic. Station, I've located Hannah Mitchell. She's deceased. I'm at coordinates. He read off the location. I'll need a recovery team and investigation support. Copy that. Cause of death? Derek looked at Hannah's skull, the filed teeth still visible. Unknown. Possibly animal attack. It's complicated. The SAR team arrived 2 hours later. Derek met them at the trail marker, his face gray with exhaustion. He gave a statement that was technically true. Found the missing hiker, found evidence of additional deceased individuals. Fire was used to signal for help, and got out of control. The bodies were badly decomposed, likely from exposure and scavengers. He didn't mention the teeth, or the way they'd moved after death, or the fire that burned down into a grave that official records said didn't exist. The investigation took 3 days. Park officials found 4 sets of remains, all matching cold cases dating back to 1927. Hannah Mitchell, Michael Reeves, missing since 1982, Alice Chen, 1954, and a fourth, too decomposed to identify, that radiocarbon dating placed around 1920. And in the grave beneath the stone, they found bones that DNA analysis eventually traced to Stefan Vasile, Romanian immigrant, who according to ship manifests had arrived in the Pacific Northwest in 1887. Cause of death, wooden stake through the heart, ash residue in oral cavity. The coroner ruled it a historical homicide, unsolved, and closed the file. Derek returned to work after a week of mandatory leave. He walked the trails, enforced regulations, educated visitors. He did his job. But he never went back to the Mineral Creek Trail, and when his radio crackled with static in the deep forest, when his GPS lost signal for no reason, when that wrongness crawled up his spine, he listened. His grandmother had been right. The gift wasn't a liability. It was a warning system. And now Derek understood why he'd been given it. Some doors, once opened, never fully close, Some protections, once broken, never fully restore, and some hungers, once awakened, never truly sleep. He started carrying a stake of hawthorn wood in his pack, just in case. On October nights when the rain fell through the ancient trees and the mist rose from the forest floor, Derek stood at the boundary of Mineral Creek Trail and felt them out there. Not many, but not gone. Never gone. The master had burned, but he'd had more than a century to spread his curse to call to others to plant seeds in the dark earth of the Pacific Northwest. Derek had saved the park that night, but he hadn't won. He'd only bought time. In his cabin, hidden in a locked drawer, he kept Hannah Mitchell's green notebook and the leather bag from the grave. He studied them in the long winter nights, learning the protection rituals, the binding words, the old ways that his grandmother had tried to teach him, and he'd refused to hear. Because Derek Holloway had finally accepted the truth. He was sensitive. He could feel the darkness, and that made him the only one who could stand against it. He just wished he'd learned that lesson before Hannah Mitchell walked into his forest. Her face haunted him in dreams, not the monster she'd become, but the girl in the permit photo, smiling, alive, with her whole life ahead of her. 22 years old and full of curiosity about the natural world, Derek wondered if she'd felt it too. That wrongness, in her final moments before the thing beneath the stone had taken her, if she'd known, the way he knew now, that some knowledge carried too high a price. The Park Service eventually closed Mineral Creek Trail. Hazardous terrain, the official report said. Risk of rockfall and flash flooding. Derek didn't correct them. Let people think it was geology. He knew better. Some places were haunted not by the past, but by what refused to stay buried. And the Hoh rainforest, with its ancient trees and endless rain and shadows that moved when they shouldn't, held more secrets than any ranger could ever fully know. Derek patrolled other trails now. He watched for signs, and when October came, he made offerings at the boundary of the closed trail. Garlic, hawthorn branches, salt. Not prayers, just precautions. Just in case the fire hadn't been enough. Just in case something else decided to wake. Hope you felt genuine terror. If you appreciate authentic horror rooted in real folklore, consider following for more stories. Which moment scared you most? Share your theory about what really happened to the two old hunters Derek never found.